So far we've looked at the kind of structure of the council and how effective it was. Another thing we need to think about is how popular both Elizabeth and her regime were in the 1590s. And we can split this into a number of different sections, if you like. First of all, how popular was Elizabeth and the council at court? Now, there were two things that were unpopular at the court. One was the size of the Privy Council, and the other was the conduct of the war. Because the Privy Council contracted in size and very few younger members were appointed, this was a bone of contention with many younger generation men who had been looking towards the death of established councillors to free up places on the Privy Council so they could pursue a political career of their own. In the 1580s, Sir Philip Sidney had griped and complained about Elizabeth being, a fussy old woman and not promoting younger men. And by the 1590s, this kind of tension was much stronger. There were also complaints that the council was a regnum Sicilianum, a kingdom of the Cecils. We know that Lord Burghley was on the council and his second son, Sir Robert Cecil, from 1591. But also, Burghley's first son, Thomas Cecil, was president of the Council of the North. And Lord Cobham, who was a member of the council, he became related to the Cecils through marriage when his daughter married Sir Robert Cecil. Now, these tensions about the council, about its size, about the way it wasn't open to enough young men, and the apparent dominance of the Cecils, exploded in 1601, when the Earl of Essex rebelled. Now, there are a number of reasons why Essex rebelled. He was increasingly paranoid, he felt people were stabbing him in the back, and he gathered around him a group of aristocrats and gentry who were sort of personally loyal to the Earl and who also thought they were losing out. But the sort of impact and the kind of unpopularity of the council didn't just stop with the men. A number of female courtiers were not really happy about the contracting size of the council. Why should they be unhappy? After all, they weren't going to become members of the council. Well, quite simply, it's because the contraction of the council meant that men couldn't develop a political career. Therefore, they couldn't settle down and get married. Therefore, female courtiers were kind of not able to fulfil their career of marrying into an aristocratic family and producing children, etc. And Paul Hammer has done some wonderful research about the 1590s to show that it's a period of kind of sexual promiscuity as the women decide, well, I'm going to have to force this man to marry me. So they actually engage in premarital sex, they have affairs, they try to get pregnant, and then they hope the man will marry them. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But it's a kind of an interesting additional aspect, and one that we might not have thought of when we're thinking about whether the Queen and the council are popular at court. What are the results of this tension or unpopularity of the council in court, both by men and by women? Well, really, I think we'd see it primarily in terms of the legacy it left for James I, and to a much lesser extent Charles I, with male courtiers. There is a lot of simmering discontent at Elizabeth in the 1590s that men are not able to get ahead with their political careers. And James has to release this content. And he does so by handing out lots and lots of titles. So Robert Cecil, in a period of about 3 years, goes from being a knight to being an earl. More particularly, though, James gives out lots of minor titles to men, and this is a way of kind of trying to kind of quash that discontent. He has to do this, but it's a problem because it actually costs him a lot of money, and James suffers from very serious financial problems in his reign. However, I think I would put a caveat on the unpopularity of the council to say that much of this is the unpopularity really comes from Essex's circle. It's these men who are discontented, and it's not necessarily broadly reflected across the court as a whole. The other reason why the council is not overly popular with at least some members of the court is over its conduct of the war. It's seen as not being daring and aggressive enough. And this is built on a kind of cultural tradition of thinking about England as a Protestant champion, supporting the Protestant Dutch rebels in the 1560s, 70s and 80s, and also the French Huguenots. Huguenots are what we call the French Protestants, and they'd been involved in a civil war against the French crown, again from the 1560s. And this builds up a kind of tradition of what Elizabethan warfare and support of Protestantism abroad should be like. It should be said, however, that this was really only of a concern to men like Essex and his followers, young, hot-headed men who wanted to engage in military glory and or were personally attached to the Earl. What about the popularity of Elizabeth and her regime outside the court? Well, let's start with Parliament. Parliament has two gripes about the Elizabethan regime in the 1590s. One is the war. They also are quite keen on a kind of daring, aggressive policy. But this is not a major problem for Elizabeth. Actually, the real problem comes with James and Charles, and we have this kind of myth of great kind of Elizabethan military and naval success, supporting Protestants abroad. And this myth is a real problem for James and Charles because it really drives Parliament in particular to push those kings into the 30 Years' War and supporting James's daughter Elizabeth and her husband, the Elector Palatine, when they get thrown out of their realms. So this is more the unpopularity of the war in Parliament really has a long-term effect rather than an immediate one. The really bigger and more immediate concern, though, is over finance, and particularly over monopolies. As I said when I was talking about the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of the council, monopolies increase in number and they become imposed on more staple goods. And this is very unpopular with Parliament. They feel that they should not be imposed on staple goods. So what happens in 1597 is Parliament tries to get rid of certainly the worst monopolies, but this fails largely because Elizabeth promises to do something about this, so therefore Parliament steps back. However, nothing does happen, so in 1601 what Parliament does is they actually propose 2 bills to get rid of monopolies altogether. The government is forced to capitulate, and Elizabeth immediately withdraws some of the most controversial monopolies. So in a sense this is a bit of a success for Parliament. However, I think there are a number of reasons why we would not want to exaggerate the tension between Parliament and the Crown and see the regime as very unpopular with Parliament. First of all, monopolies are really only unpopular with a section of Parliament, and specifically the common lawyers. So it's not a really, really big concern for Parliament as a whole. Second, the Commons in particular never hold the regime to hostage over financial concerns, whether that's monopolies or indeed over grants of taxation. We see this actually happening in the 1620s, when Parliament wants Charles to redress their grievances, and in return for that, they will grant him taxation. And this is actually how Parliament works. Parliament is a time where the country can put forward its grievances to the monarch, who should resolve them, and then Parliament votes taxation to the monarch. It's a kind of almost a pro quo relationship. Under Elizabeth, whatever the tensions, whatever the unpopularity of the regime, the House of Commons, who are in charge of voting taxation, never withhold taxation to get their grievances resolved. They believe that there is this relationship between redress of grievances and taxation, and that the Crown will honour it. And in fact, the Crown does. Finally, I would also point to how successful Elizabeth is at kind of managing discontent. Because in 1601, she gives what is referred to as the Golden Speech in response to Parliament criticising monopolies. She gathers around her MPs and makes this wonderful speech in which she emphasises the kind of good relationship between her and her subjects, how much she loves her subjects and how she wouldn't do anything to harm them or to annoy them. And this is more than just a speech. There's a ceremony of when the MPs kneel and when they stand up, and that they're able to take the Queen's hand. So she's a master at being able to deal with people and get people back on her side. And the Golden Speech is then printed and circulated. And this seems to kind of stop and make good the relationships between the Queen and Parliament. So though there are tensions between Parliament and the Queen and her regime, they're not as serious as they are in the early 17th century, and Elizabeth is actually able to deal with these quite effectively.